looking at Chapter 8, Sections 2 and 3 in Advanced Placement United States History, as far as slavery in the crisis of context of Western expansion, as well as the significant battles, turning points, and overall final results of the Civil War. To start off, as always, we'll analyze our document. Now, a few things that must be noted with this document would be, as always, our C3 approach. Starting off with content. As always, most of your content's located right up here in the source. So we know that it is a speech, which is important to understand for the critique. Location, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and the year is 1863. Now, we don't actually have an author presented, but we know it's Lincoln. Okay, and you would support this given both the location and the year, as well as the fact that documents A and B have both already established that President Lincoln is in fact in charge of the country. Now, as far as items that should be noted in here is the intensity and emphasis under religion, as well as the use of his language that is presented in here as well. Okay, now why do we bring in the component of religion? Well, for the most part, it's a unifying factor for the majority of the country. So, given partisanship between the Confederacy and the Union forces, we know that a significant portion of said individuals can relate to Christianity, which is why this is one of the components that's emphasized here. Now, that being said, other items here that we have that could be discussed: the dead shall not have died in vain. Now, we analyze this because this is post the Battle of Gettysburg, in which case multiple soldiers of both Union and Confederate forces had fought and died for a conflict. But one thing that must be emphasized is that this is a singular component of a greater issue, which is obviously called the Civil War, related to both economic factors and the emphasis of slavery. Okay? That being said, the overall theme presented with this document is the fact that we are looking forward. Okay? We understand that many have died for this conflict, but one shall look forward. Looking forward to the critique section here. Author, it's not provided, but we know that it's Lincoln. So credibility is acceptable. As always, we analyze the ongoing question: just because one is president, does that make him credible? Given this situation, location, education, and involvement in the issue, yes, the source, the author of the source is credible, even though the specific author is not provided. That being said, as well, is the source as a whole credible? Well, one must understand that it is a speech. It is a speech, so as always with speeches, there are a component of bias. But if you analyze this speech, can you really extract a bias component presented here? Not really. Intended audience, those at the forum post the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, one could argue, is this speech directed at the Union forces or the Confederate forces, or the Union government or the Confederate government? Well, one must understand that this is a very broad and open address. It is addressed to the nation as a whole. So that being said, as far as your intended audience, it would be the citizenship or the people, okay, of the United States. Both soldiers, government, and citizens in general. Moving forward here, the objective that we've presented today is describe how slavery became a crisis in the context of Western expansion. So some themes that must be present are the obvious here: slavery and Western expansion. Your focus topics of the day are presented here. The Missouri Compromise to start us off. Well, how does this relate to the crisis of slavery in the context of Western expansion? We are looking at the policy of appeasement here. As always, appeasement meaning giving in to the demands, possibly, or bestowing rights to those who could become an aggressor. That being said, we're looking at the South. The balance in the Senate is absolutely a critical objective of the government between the issue of slave versus free states. Again, how does this relate? We're looking at this right here already. Western expansion, how do these territories become states? Well, we need a procedural approach. Senator Henry Clay argued that Maine will enter the Union as a free state, Missouri will enter as a slave state. One for one, tit for tat. That being said, one thing that will be exceptionally important that we'll discuss here in a little bit is that slavery north of 3630 is prohibited. Okay? No slavery above that latitudinal line. Continuing forward here, the nullification crisis and compromise of 1833. relating to 1828's tariff, the Tariff of Abominations. Well, if you analyze what's being presented here, we're looking at Southern politicians versus the Union or the federal government as a whole. Okay, and you can see President Jackson's reaction to this as far as dealing with the nullification crisis. But how does this relate back to the context of slavery and Western expansion? Well, this is an icon of the power of the government. Okay, as far as interfering, one would argue, or you could say assisting in the addressing of issues prominent to the nation as a whole as well as the regions, specifically the South. Well, again, how does this relate to and how does this develop aggravation within Southern governments? It's a tariff. One problem with tariffs is that usually they result in a highly retaliatory tariff, and that is a problem for the Southern government, specifically because the Southern governments dealing with the trade of cotton are trading primarily with European countries. Any kind of retaliatory tariff could possibly exhaust and demolish the entire Southern economy, which, though it would possibly assist the northern manufacturing districts, it could impact the economy of the nation as a whole. Henry Clay's Compromise. President Fillmore, anytime we have an individual, a politician, I recommend you always highlight or underline those people. California enters as a free state. Okay, here are provisions within this. So, California free state, fugitive slave law, and this is that tit for tat approach, you get something, we get something. Fugitive Slave Law 1850, rigidly enforced. Again, we have fugitive slave laws already in effect, but now we're vowing as a federal government, okay, not just regional state governments and looking at this as north versus south, the federal government will be enforcing this. Again, it's grotesque, but these slaves are viewed as property, and constitutionally speaking, the property shall be returned to the owner. Okay? One other provision here, slave trade, not the ownership of slaves, banned in the nation's capital. Well, one says, is this truly progress? Well, it is progress, but the overall theme here, as far as the ultimate goals, morally speaking, would be the abolition of slavery. Why is this even included? It's one area, one specific city, but it is the nation's capital. The trade is banned, not the ownership, because you have Southern politicians that are engaged all the time in Washington, D.C. as both senators. You could have other political offices, representatives in Congress, that they themselves own slaves. If you were to ban the ownership of slaves in the nation's capital, that could potentially be the catalyst for a much greater uproar, leading to eventually the Civil War. Okay, land taken from Mexico divided into two territories, New Mexico and Utah. Both territories determine the status of slavery by popular sovereignty. Well, how does this truly relate to the context of Western expansion? These are, well, with the exception of Utah, southern territories. That being said, one could argue that, given geographic location, popular sovereignty would ultimately govern through some emphasis with the Union or the North, and Southern politicians, how they would determine free versus slave. Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, here again, we have a politician, Senator Stephen A. Douglas, looking at a development of a railroad through Illinois. These are in his lands, so we're looking to generate some money here, which obviously, for the most part, with many people would argue that truly is power. Must get support from Southern senators. Again, this is a northern state involving his territory, but we need these individuals to sway this in both the Senate and the House. Nebraska territory divided into two, Kansas and Nebraska, which will eventually become Kansas and Nebraska we know to this contemporary moment. Settlers in those areas determine the status of slavery by popular sovereignty. Not that bad, but there's one major issue here. Both of those territories are located north of that 3630 line, which we've already established in the Missouri Compromise. Now, to this degree, what merit does the Missouri Compromise have anymore? We've already admitted the states into the Union as both a free and a slave state. Now we're looking at the admission of Kansas and Nebraska through popular sovereignty, but we've already established legally that north of 3630 is to not even entertain the idea of slavery. It's closed to slavery. Progress? This is a political mess in Washington, D.C. leading to Bleeding Kansas, the icon of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the question, once again, Kansas is free or slave. We know that they can determine this through popular sovereignty. Missouri will send border ruffians. Why Missouri? Well, Missouri is a slave state. Okay, we're trying to sway that vote. The response to that, the New England Emigrant Society will send people to sway the vote. Pro-slavery advocates feature a government in Lecompton, Kansas, hence when we'll talk about the Lecompton Constitution. Opponents, a government in Topeka, Kansas. So again, slave versus free. Kansas would enter a free state until, so we have, and look at this roller coaster here, enters as a free state until Buchanan, President Buchanan, accepts the Lecompton Constitution, acknowledging as a slave state. So we entered free, now we're slave. Anti-slavery advocates will protest this and join forces with the Republicans, which are primarily your northern politicians, pro-manufacturing, pro-business, pro-immigration, etc., etc. We're going to join forces with them. Okay? 1858, we enter as a free state. So look at this. We went from free to slave with President Buchanan to free once again with the emphasis of Congress, okay? Because this is the easy way to review this. Was there conflict? Political conflict is the emphasis here. Was there bloodshed? There were small skirmishes, absolutely, but that's politics. Okay, was this an actual battle? Was this a true conflict? No, but there was politics involved here, which will ultimately make this a giant issue, leading to an icon of conflict. John Brown's Harper Ferry Raid, 1859. Now, that being said here, we have that eye for an eye approach, which I know all of you have applied to certain circumstances in your life, possibly, or you've heard other people do that. Okay, what we have here, we seize a federal, we, being John Brown and his followers, federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Okay, West Virginia, eventually, but again, that split doesn't actually occur until the start of the Civil War. Brown's goal is to have local slaves join forces in rebellion, taking up arms. However, with the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee, which we know will be a significant role player in the conflict of the Civil War, this ultimate rebellion was just squashed. Now, Brown was hanged for his rebellion, but he's viewed as a martyr. Again, what is a martyr? A martyr is someone who dies for their cause. So the ultimate theme of this specific section was this small skirmish successful? Short term and long term. Short term, we'll analyze this first. The microcosm of the greater issue. Was it successful? Did slavery still exist? Yes. Was there conflict? Did people die? Yes. Was it successful? Short term, many would argue probably not, but look at the long term application here. Okay? Fear in the heart of Southerners. Now that would be both slave owners within the planter aristocracy as well as those who don't own any slaves. It's fearful. We now have that component of that these individuals could rise up at any point in time. There are more of them per capita. If you look at plantations for the most part, there are more of them than there are the actual owners. So would this be a giant issue should it arise to fruition as conflict? Absolutely. Long-term application continued. He's a martyr. We always remember an individual who will die for their cause. Look at Joan of Arc. Look at multiple other people all throughout history, world history, as well as the United States. One who dies for their cause is someone that possibly not respected, but truly understood as being someone who intensely felt application to an issue, that being the existence of slavery in this application here. So was it long-term successful? Absolutely. Though slavery continues to exist in 1859, we know that the Civil War is going to take place, which will ultimately result in its abolishment. Short-term success? Debatable. Most would say not. Long-term? Absolutely. Continuing on, Section 3, Chapter 8. Here we're going to look at specific battles, okay, as noted with our objective here. Now we're going to continue forward here. This would have been the component of the journal entry. We didn't have time for that due to the snow day, so we're going to continue forward. The document, Second Inaugural Address. Well, if one is issuing an inaugural address, means they're president. 1865. We know the time period. We know the issue. We now know it's President Lincoln once again. So that would drop instantly down to author. Credible author, absolutely. Given context, time period, events, education, experience, etc., etc., etc. Yes. Okay. Looking at this here, you can understand that the issue of the Civil War is truly becoming a larger quagmire than we originally thought it was going to be. Again, you can still see the emphasis of religion. It's a unifying factor. but also look at the diction that President Lincoln is using compared to previous documents that we've analyzed. Okay? This is becoming an intense issue. Contextually speaking, we're looking at the resolve of this issue, even though it's involved in conflict. Overall theme with the document, the war must end. The bloodshed must end because thousands of people are dying for a cause that really, to most people, morally speaking, should have been common sense anyway. Slavery shall not exist. It should be abolished. Okay? Intended audience, it's an inaugural address. That means that it would be the people or the citizens of the U.S. Okay? As well as Congress and other notable government positions. Continuing forward here, describe the details and results of major battles. We have several here. Now, one thing that must be analyzed here, first Bull Run, that's a body of water. Manassas, that's a city, 1861. It depends on the perspective of where you're analyzing, whether it's known as First Manassas or First Bull Run. Ultimately, 1861, Confederate victory. Peninsula Campaign, 1862, also known as a 7 Days War. Okay, or 7 Days Battle, excuse me. Confederate victory made possible by Robert E. Lee. There he is again. He quashed John Brown's raid. Now he's representing Confederate forces, 1862. 1862 continued. Second Bull Run, Second Manassas, Confederate victory. How is this looking for the Union right now? This war, this conflict was never expected to last more than a few weeks. Here we are, 1862, the Union is 0-3. Confederate forces are taking charge. Now, another component of this battle that I'd like you to understand is the cultural component, because many politicians within the first several battles of this conflict would actually appear on the countryside, picnic with their families, and enjoy a good theatrical performance, that being the battle. And I know that sounds grotesque, but again, that was the culture of the time. Antietam, 1862, also known as Sharpsburg, Union victory, okay? Turned Confederate invasion of the North back south, allowed for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, okay? Issuing the fact that slavery shall be abolished in the territories. Now, it's not accepted in Congress, it's a proclamation, okay? This is the idea. This is the cause that we are fighting for. This also, historically speaking, is the bloodiest battle with the highest death toll of any conflict in United States history to occur on her soil. Fredericksburg, 1862, Confederate victory. All right, we're now 1-4 in major battles here. Monitor and Merrimack. We're looking at the institution of naval warfare here, as far as using what are known as ironclads, which are what these two are. If you ever get a chance, there's an excellent to-scale model at the in Washington D.C., the Smithsonian United States History Museum. There's a model there I'd like you guys to check out, specifically the juniors that are going on the Washington, D.C. trip in March. That being said, we're looking at response to the Anaconda Plan. All right, that like an anaconda, a constricting snake, we're trying to exhaust or suffocate the economy of the South. They're primarily trading with foreign foes or foreign allies, so we need to try to exhaust this economy that they have. In response to that, we launched the Merrimack. Then we proceed to do so with the Monitor. Okay, Merrimack initially very successful. You have an ironclad, an iron hull ship with an excellent artillery aboard it, conflicting and fighting against our wooden ships. All right, that's one of the examples of why the Maxim gun, for example, was so devastational to the tribes of Africa, specifically South Africa, because you're shooting or you're fighting technology with subsistence existence, if you want to look at it like that, as far as the merit of technology. North launched their ironclad, the Monitor, and fought the battle to a draw. However, why is this included? Again, we're looking at significant battles and turning points. Why? Because of the extent of military technology, as well as the fact that the Anaconda Plan is going to be extended even further to go upwards into the Mississippi River. Okay? Moving forward here, continuing with our objective. Gettysburg, 1863. Most famous battle ever fought on American soil. Now, again, we've already covered that within the document. And another application that I'd like you guys to check out, if you haven't seen the movie, remember the Titans, there's an excellent scene where the football team travels to the battlefield itself to reiterate the fact of why does unification need to occur even during the midst of the civil rights movement. Okay? Turn the final invasion final. That's a great word to be analyzing there. Final invasion of the Confederate forces back south, considered the turning point of the war. Most important idea here, most important turning point of the war, as well as gave cause to the issuing of the Gettysburg Address. Vicksburg, 1863, gave control of the Mississippi River to the north, effectively cutting the Confederacy in half. Again, that's the extension of the AP Anaconda Plan. Okay, we're cutting off their economy to the west, the south, and the east as well. So, to the north is us. So, that's what they're dealing with. Sherman's March to the Sea, 1864. Confederacy once again cut in twain. Sherman's forces institute a policy of total war. Well, what is total war? That's the overall mindset that one must establish here. What is total war? All forces, all application directed to the singular cause of winning the war. Now, within Sherman's March to the Sea, several things that some would say were possibly sketchy occurred, as far as the pillaging of villages and cities along the way, the destruction of agricultural foodstuffs, the destruction of munitions, and the use of munitions by the Union forces, ultimately which people would say were too far. Okay? But again, this is the mindset of total war. Thus, several people would argue it's a necessity. Petersburg Campaign, 1864-65. Grant and his forces closed in on Richmond, the Confederate capital, which was originally located in Alabama, then moved to Richmond, but now we are looking at the capital itself. Appomattox Courthouse, 1865. The Union is officially declared the victor. General Robert E. Lee surrenders to General Grant. Eventually, he will become president. 5 days later, Lincoln assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford Theater. Ultimately, I mean, there's still a lot of questions involving this assassination, but you also do, juniors going on the Washington, D.C. trip, get to see the theater. You don't get to go in, but you do get to see where this all occurred within Washington, D.C.